So today we're going to be talking primarily about digital and feature writing style. This should be mostly a refresher from your 200 level course for MC writing. However, I know that in 200, we really focus on all different types of writing. And so we want to realign our thinking back to print and digital. So the first thing we have to keep in mind is when we are doing our AP style, right? We want to write for print and digital AP style. If you're not aware, there are different formats of AP style for broadcast versus digital versus print. So when you go into the back of your book, for example, you might want to look at the social media section when you're writing your Instagram post for this class or your TikToks, right? And then there, of course, are broadcasting styles of AP. We want to forget anything that's not print and digital AP style. Print and digital writing should still focus on simple sentences, though. While broadcast is perhaps even more simple in its writing and a little more straightforward, we want to remember subject, verb, object as much as possible, right? We want to have a subject that is doing an action and that and what they are acting upon. So keep that in mind. We want to keep our sentences simple. We also want to have active voice. So we should not be writing in passive voice, which your AP review goes over how to control for active and passive. But I know that that's an area of AP style that's very difficult for people. So throughout your writing, especially in your editing process, look back and say, is this active? Are there actions being done by that subject? And writing in that subject, verb, object style will really help you to be able to do that. We want to have focused and organized writing. So we will be talking about how you can format your writing so that it's organized and flowing in a particular way, specifically for feature writing. Even though we're doing features, we always want to make sure to answer those critical questions of journalism, the 5 W's and an H. We got who, we got
What?
Where?
Why?
When?
Yep.
And how?
And how is our H. Excellent. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. So we need to look back through our articles and say, have I answered all of these questions? And especially with digital and feature writing, you're going to want to make sure that in that why and how, you're really exploring those in depth, right? Offering balanced and various viewpoints, not just your basic, hey, here's your 2 points of view. We want to make sure that we have a structure to our writing. This goes back to it being organized, it making sense, and we'll go into these different types of structures here in a minute. We want it to be fact-driven. We want it to be objective. This means that our personal opinions are not in it. Now, we had a great discussion last week about objectivity and transparency. Those things need to be in your writing. We want to use multiple sources, and particularly for digital and feature writing, we have a focus on using quotes from people who are affected by the things we are writing about. Feature stories are primarily feature stories because they feature real people, real issues. So again, keep that in mind as you're writing. You will need to have an over-reliance on sources for digital and feature writing. We want to also start to include interactive elements. Since we're primarily writing digital pieces, this means finding hyperlinks that can inform our audience beyond just our article. That's part of transparency too, is making sure that we are providing information and the sources that we get it from. So we also want to try to make it multimedia and visual in focus. So taking photos or even incorporating videos for our stories that are digital in nature. We want to make sure that we have transitions and signposts to tell our reader where we are going, what they should expect in our writing. And then, of course, we need to be interesting. We need to fight for the attention of our audience in our writing. So these are the primary skills for digital writing that we need to start incorporating. And we're going to go into a lot of these in much more detail as we progress throughout the semester. So in terms of organization, when we talk about print journalism, the most common style of writing in print journalism has been the inverted pyramid style. We went over this in 200, but as a refresher, the inverted pyramid style is when the most important facts go up top. Those 5 W's and H should be within your first sentence or two. And you're putting additional color and detail with lesser important things going towards the bottom. Why do we use the inverted pyramid style in print writing? And the images used in this pyramid might help you figure out why.
Because readers are only going to read the first part of the article, so you want to put the most important pressing information up top.
That is definitely true. So it's part of keeping audience focused so that if someone were to only read the first paragraph, they still have a pretty good understanding of what's going on. Why would we have these little scissors on this pyramid as well? What's another reason for using the inverted pyramid style?
It's easier for editors to trim it down if it gets too long or anything.
Exactly.
Because it gets too more narrow and not as important, I guess.
Yes, exactly. So when we're talking about a print publication where there is actually a physical space boundary of how much content can go in, and the layout of that content is really important, the inverted pyramid style was used as a shortcut by editors so that if you had, let's say, an 800-word piece, but you only had room for 500, you would just cut off the last 300 words and there would be very little editing that needed to be done. So the point of an inverted pyramid style is either if the reader doesn't get to the bottom or if there's not even enough space to publish it, you're still getting the primary facts in. So again, inverted pyramid style focuses information up top. It allows the audience who don't make it to the end to know what's happening. Writers consider the most newsworthy pieces of information and organize them in order of decreasing newsworthiness. The inverted pyramid style also helps us in our writing process, though, because it can show us, hey, I'm missing a very important piece of information here. And instead, I have a bunch of fluff. So I need to go back and find this important piece of information. It also allows us clarity and the ability to shorten our pieces as needed. But the inverted pyramid style isn't perfect for every type of journalism. It's actually very rigid in nature. It gets to be very repetitive. And when we're talking about a competitive digital environment, we don't want our stories to all look the same. There have been studies additionally that show that less educated people find it harder to read inverted pyramid style of organization because you're relying on that person to understand the facts of the situation without much context. Whereas if you were to introduce someone's story about how they were affected by something up top and then introduce the facts, you can really interpret that information more through a narrative rather than being facts-based. It really locked journalists into a formula and discourages creativity. And so a lot of journalists have been calling it overused, confusing, or irrelevant for a long time, especially in the digital world. And so for feature writing, we tend not to use the inverted pyramid style as much. Instead, for feature writing, we're going to want to emphasize people, and people should normally go first. Yes, I do have closed captioning turned on, by the way, for our anyone who's hearing impaired or prefers to read what I'm saying. So that is done purposefully, just FYI. So newsworthy elements still go on top within our leads, but there is an additional emphasis and focus on quotes and descriptions, but we're still putting less essential information towards the bottom of the section. So it's this is kind of a revised inverted pyramid, and image to the right is actually the one that would be more used in feature news compared to the straight inverted pyramid style. Now, an hourglass structure is a different type of organization. The hourglass story uses the inverted pyramid style, but then has a turn, a key where you combine narrative or timing in order to talk about how a series of events happens. So it combines the strength of the inverted pyramid style and then provides us a narrative format. So you would put the most information up top within probably the first 3 paragraphs, and then you're going to turn it and make it so that it then becomes more narrative in focus. So you're talking about facts base and then story or time base at the bottom. And that's how the hourglass structure works. So the key to the hourglass structure is that turn. And that can be very difficult to transition from facts to narrative, but you have to find that connection of that person or organization, that place that you're featuring, and connect it really well to the facts that are up top. Now, the anecdotal style is a type of feature style writing that is very, very common for feature writing. It focuses on a particular individual situation or anecdote at the top of the story to be able to illustrate a larger problem. For instance, this article is about how there are children who are playing video games on video game systems, and they're entering in credit card information to be able to purchase digital content, and then that account gets hacked. So what should parents do? So instead of giving you facts about how many people are hacked each year, or how often this occurs, we meet Luke Martin, right? Luke Martin has some extra time on his hands, and so he starts playing video games, but then he gets hacked, right? And so he tries logging into his platform. $200 of games he had purchased had vanished, and he only had $1.10 remaining in his account. So what would be the purpose of this anecdote in this article? Why would we use this style of writing for organizing?
Does it kind of like demonstrate relevancy more? Like it makes it more readable and like personable?
Yes, exactly. So as we talked about with, some of the disadvantages of inverted pyramid, it's like facts are kind of not as engaging. And because they're not as engaging, it's harder for us to learn that material. If I just spouted out what anecdotal style is without providing an example of it, it would be harder for you to really understand the differences between different styles of journalism, right? So an anecdote within journalism is an example of the larger issue. So it talks about one person's experience to show us what's really going on and making it more accessible and engaging to your readers because it makes it more personable. Good job, Danielle. So the anecdotal style relies on 4 parts of writing. It's going to always have a lead. And sorry, I hate the way our textbook writes the word lead, L-E-D-E. I know that's the proper way to write it, but occasionally I forget to change the spelling. Okay, so just ignore it. You can write it either way. Most people in the industry do not call it an L-E-D-E. They call it a lead, like I have it here. But anyway, you should write it as lead because that's what your textbook says. Anyway, so the lead is typically 3 paragraphs that describe the anecdote. It's that person's story. It's that instance, the smaller instance of the larger picture. So your lead is an anecdote lead. It tells us a small description to let us know what the larger central point of the story is. Now the nut graph, or the primary part of your story, of the body of your story, transitions you from that lead example, the anecdote, and then gives the central point of the story. So what might be the central point of the story that I just provided an example of? What types of information would we want in that nut graph?
What exactly happened?
happened to whom or what? Be a little more
Like-
specific, Olivia.
I guess just like how it connects to like other people, like what does it have in common with like everything else? Because this is just one example and we have
Yes.
to make it so it relates to everything else.
Exactly. So it's broadening the scope of what has happened. If this were just a singular instance where this poor kid had $200 stolen, would it really be newsworthy? No. Instead, we need to now transition from this anecdote of this one kid to show that it's now a larger issue. So we need to show how many times people are getting hacked, how often it happens, why it happens, how we can prevent it, things like that. So that's going to be your nut graph. It's going to be the central point of the story. It's what makes it newsworthy. And it illustrates, it shows you the broader picture of what your lead has demonstrated. So the body develops the central point in detail. So anything that you write after that nut graph needs to connect back to the idea within your central idea, your central point of the story. So for example, would I put how many hours kids typically play video games in the body of the story? What do you think? Yes or no? No, right? Because that's not really an important detail to video game systems being hacked, right? Instead, what if I talked about how much money people typically leave in their accounts? Would that be part of the central point? Yeah, sure. Because it talks about, how much money we're really talking about when we're talking about being hacked. So the conclusion then wraps up in about 2 to 3 paragraphs, the central idea of the story. And typically for an anecdote style story, you're going to want to refer back to the case that you started with. So for example, we need to talk about whether Luke Martin got his money back or whether his parents are trying to advocate for better safety practices from gaming software. We're wanting to kind of tie it up a little bit. But remember, we don't want to tie up conclusions as if, they're fairy tales, because it's likely that Luke Martin's family just lost their money and that's it. But we could show, well, now instead of having money in the system, they make each purchase separately and they don't save their credit card information, something like that. So another style of feature writing is called the narrative style. And the narrative style relies on 2 parts, the story and the storyteller. So you want to think about like novels here, right? You want to think about writing in terms of like fiction writing, but making it nonfiction that is factually based, which can be a difficult, line to walk. But we need to find people who are crucial to the action. And we as journalists, our job in a narrative style story is then to observe them, not interject our opinions about what happened or what they did, but to describe in a story format from beginning, middle, and end what their experience was like. It uses storytelling techniques like flashbacks, dialogue, changing the differences in time. Like I might be talking about something that happened here, but then we'll talk about something that happened in their past so that we can explain what happened here. These tend to be longer. They're much harder to cut. They're definitely feature-driven stories, but they allow for more creativity. They allow for drama. They allow for storytelling, right? And they're not appropriate for all types of stories either. A wonderful example of narrative style journalistic writing is Dave Cullen's books on Columbine and Parkland. If you haven't read these, they're really interesting. I promise I won't talk about school shootings like every class. It's just what I study. So it's, I work a lot in these areas. But what Dave Cullen did after Parkland is he went and found students who were actually involved as victims, you know, a lot of the March for Our Lives kids. And he went and he sat in the basement with them when they were coming up with their plan. You know, he watched them as they went on marches, as they worked with media partners, as they, you know, underwent the emotional traumas that they did. He stayed with them for almost a year, trying to get their stories and talking about what they went through. And so it allows for a little more subjectivity, but instead of giving your opinion about whether what they're doing is right or wrong, you're just kind of narrating what happened and allowing the reader to decide, right? So a descriptive style is a story that tells the news from the perspective of their sources. So while narrative style focuses on the storyteller's perspective, the descriptive style tells the story from the perspective of the source. Where narrative is like you're standing next to the reporter, descriptive is where you're standing next to the source or the feature. Okay, it gives you rich visualizations of what that source goes through, typically on a day-to-day basis. Your book describes it as sitting in the cockpit alongside the pilot, right? So that you're experiencing what your feature is experiencing. And multimedia storytelling is especially helpful for this because it brings in that rich visualization of the content. So this article is called "I Slice Up Human Brains for a Living," right? That does not sound appealing to me. But the story is about a researcher in Alzheimer research, right? And so we get an inside look at how this doctor does what he does, right? You may notice that the journalist uses first person here. I discourage first person writing for journalism, but you know, we can allow exceptions here and there. But the reason that they're using first person here is because they're wanting you to see that they are walking the very tunnel that this person walks, right? You're emerging into an old hospital building, a square room stacked floor to ceiling with plastic boxes. What's in those plastic boxes? Brains. But this is very descriptive. You can get a real sense of visual image without even looking at the image of what's going on. So it really relies on very descriptive, vivid imagery within your writing. Now, another way to structure feature writing, and this is good for all styles of journalism, honestly, is the SEQ structure. The SEQ structure is a statement, evidence, quote. And this is a format you can use throughout your writing, no matter what style you're using. But the structure allows you to kind of format your sentences in the proper way. So SEQ structure would be providing a statement that you then back up with evidence and then give a quote from an expert or a source as a reaction to it. So for instance, and this is fake, I made this up, so don't like go and be like, oh, Dr. Stewart said this. No, this is fake. I made this up. College students have barely begun spring semester, but administrators are already thinking about summer term. That's the statement, right? But now I need to back that up with evidence. So I'm going to provide the evidence that university officials announced today summer semester would only be offered online. That actually is true, by the way. We're full online for summer. Okay. But then we provide a quote that further backs up that evidence and provides a more personal perspective of what that evidence is. So we have a quote from Dr. Stewart saying the why of the evidence. Would I want to include a quote from Dr. Stewart that just says Montevallo will be offering summer classes in online only formats? Would I want a quote where he says exactly that? Why or why not?
No, because you already said that in your introduction to his quote.
Right. Why do we use quotes? Why should we use quotes in feature writing or really in any type of journalism?
To give a unique perspective.
Okay, so it's
that
someone's
you can't
unique
offer.
perspective that you can offer. Okay, so to offer that person's perspective, what else would we use a quote for?
It's like evidence or like a source from somebody else instead of just saying it came from you.
Okay, so we would want maybe to have an expert in that example. So instead of us saying something that may not have as much credibility coming from a third party, I could instead use an expert to say it. So for instance, me saying that, people should wear a mask, if I'm not supporting that with perhaps expert evidence from, say, Dr. Fauci, then it might have less credibility. So we would want to use quotes for expertise, for personal perspectives. What else? We're missing a really big reason for using quotes.
So it doesn't sound biased.
Okay,
like,
so
you
it is
don't include bias.
It is a form of evidence. And a lot of times if we have something that, well, never mind, that would give away the answer. But okay, keep going. Why else do we use quotes? We're missing the two biggest reasons that we use quotes as journalists. What do you think? What does Dr. Stewart's response here provide? Compared to what I put in blue?
It has more information,
Okay.
or like as a reason why they're going online.
Okay, so, and it really seems more emotional, right? The why is emotion, right? We care about our students. We want them to be safe. We want them to get a good education. And so this is the reason that we chose to do this thing, right? So here, Dr. Stewart's quote adds a little bit of emotion to the piece. Can we put our personal feelings and emotion in it? That's what sources are for, right? So the main reason that we use quotes from sources are to provide opinion where we cannot provide our own. So we want them to provide opinion. We want them to be emotional. So we don't want someone to just state basic facts that we could write on our own. We want them to add a bit of color or emotion to it. We want them to provide their unique perspective. And we want them to offer expert advice where we cannot credibly say something, where someone with a little more credibility might be able to do so.